Have you ever had moments where you realize you are a complete idiot and should not be allowed to interact with the public? And the only thing that gives you hope for yourself is that others might be just as big on the idiot scale as you. And I've had more of those than you can possibly imagine. Like the time that I walked into a classroom in a library. I don't know, it's making me cry already. A classroom in a library and saw a bunch of students on their knees searching through the carpet. And I said, "Oh no, did someone lose a contact?" And I actually got on my knees and started to look with them, and no one responded, at which moment I realized it was a bunch of students praying on their knees. Yeah, didn't tell me. Yes, I did that. Or the time that my wife Jackie and I got in a full-on argument. I'm talking about this was a good argument on a drive about how much gas was in our truck, until we realized that we were each reading different gauges on the dashboard. A full-on argument, like super mad at each other. Yes, that happened too, and I was a leading protagonist in that. So isn't it so interesting, that moment where you suddenly see it clearly, you see it for what it actually is or for what's happening, that moment that you realize that the way you saw it is off, and how much clarity and calm that comes if you had only seen it clearly from the beginning. And if we had seen things more clearly and seen ourselves more clearly, like how much more difference would it have made in our ability to be our best selves under pressure? I'm Dr. Rob McKenna, and welcome to the Wild Conversation, where we make the best thinking in psychology, leadership, and organizational science accessible to leaders who are willing to learn and edit for their sake and for the sake of others. And today we're finishing our series on strategies for leading under pressure. And our focus today specifically is on elevating self-awareness. And just to go where we've been, in the previous weeks, we tackled such important research-based strategies such as purposeful conviction, changing perspective, and Dr. Tiffany Powell tackled building relationships last week. All the topics we covered are not only supported by rigorous research, but also are incredibly practical and actionable strategies. They just work. So when you connect that research to that practice, that's where it gets kind of powerful. So my question is this, is how has elevating your self-awareness helped you be more composed under pressure? And just yesterday, I asked a few of the members of the Wild Leaders team that question. And here's what they said. I asked, it was interesting. All of them got back within 5 minutes with a straight on comment. I won't read them all because they all got back. So I got a ton of comments. I grabbed the first couple. Sabbath on our team said, "Becoming more self-aware of my selfless personality has given me the strength to deny feeling pressured to say yes when everything points to the necessity of saying no." That's pretty good, right? Dr. Daniel Halleck said, "My elevated self-awareness allows me to know which moments uniquely cause me pressure and insights into my default response so that I can make a better choice when the pressure is on." Claire said, "Self-awareness surrounding how I take things personally has allowed me to be able to quickly take a big step back in high pressure situations, see more clearly what is personal and what has nothing to do with me, and feel much more at peace with my response." And Dr. James McPherson said, I'll read his as well. He said, "Becoming more aware of my desire to contribute to unleashing the desired competencies of others, I can rest in knowing that individual and organizational outcomes are not solely dependent on me." I thought that was very interesting what James said. As I talk through this, I'm going to use a term that some of you will be familiar with, and the term is leadership differentiation. Leadership differentiation is the leader's capacity, our capacity, to know ourselves and communicate what matters to us and what we think should happen, while at the same time, this is a long sentence, while at the same time hearing and understanding and giving weight to what matters to others and what they think should happen, and doing all that even in the midst of high pressure moments. Like, how do we stay clear about where we're going, where and why, communicating that, and also staying connected to where other folks think we need to go and why, and staying connected to that in those high pressure situations. It's important because it's the foundational building block of so much that we do at Wild Leaders through our system for developing leader capacity at the deepest levels. for producing healthy and high-performing work environments. When people within an organization are working hard at becoming more differentiated as leaders, it makes every other effort look better and is the cause of organizational health and performance beneath every symptom that consultants and leaders sometimes try to band-aid. And it takes work and a long-term investment to actually start to build that capacity in each of us. And as I read the response from our team members, there was a stream of thought that emerged that is consistent with the research on leaders and their, quote, selves. Okay, their selves, that's us. Not to mention how deeply grateful I am. Just when I read all their comments, and there were so many I didn't even read, just how grateful I am to work with a team like this. And I'll say this, here's the 3 layers of this conversation. First is that self-awareness is a knowing, a working hard at seeing it clearly. And that second, once we see it clearly, there is a choice to make. An awareness helps us see the choice. And that choice is what's called self-regulation, which I'm going to highlight as well. And third, that not all choices are equal. At least in my perspective, taking full responsibility and not blaming others plays a key role in our emotional health and in reducing reactivity. And that is what is called recognizing contribution. So let me talk for just a second about the impact of self-awareness on leader performance. While self-awareness is certainly not the only predictor of leadership performance, it has been shown to be a key to releasing other abilities that allow leaders to regulate their own responses to the needs, wants, and emotions of those they lead. An inability to understand our presence with others creates the possibility for misunderstanding, reactivity, poorly directed actions, and a lack of connection to our key stakeholders. And I mean, when I say stakeholders, and that's a big word, but I mean like whether it's family in the next 2 weeks or big time work situations. And I'll say this, that perception matters. I just want to take a little side trail for a moment because this is an important part of this, and it matters to our ability to stay clear and calm. I want to read to you something from Albert Bandura. And if you don't know who Bandura is, he's the mastermind behind what's called social cognitive theory. And social cognitive theory, like basically think of social, I think of it this way, together, how we think. Like that's kind of the way that's my layperson's way of describing social cognitive theory. And he describes it as an agentic, meaning we have agency, we have the power to choose, an empowering psychological perspective. This is what social cognitive theory is, in which individuals are proactive and self-regulating rather than reactive and controlled either by environmental or biological forces. And this is what Bandura says. This is just one citation. He talks about some of the research. He says this, the power of control beliefs. In other words, do I believe I have control? Okay, that's what he's talking about. I love psychological writing. It's sometimes hard to see through. The power of control beliefs to transform frightening environments into benign ones was graphically demonstrated in research. In one study, inhaling a CO2 mixture induces panic attacks in agoraphobics. Okay, inducing that. So in what they said was in one group, they had a control group and an experimental group. One group inhaled the mixture without control over it. Another group inhaled it under illusory control. So they didn't actually have control, but I'll explain. Believing they could regulate how much CO2 they received by turning a valve. But unbeknownst to them, the valve was disconnected. So they inhaled a constant amount of CO2 mixture. Agoraphobics who had no control experienced mounting anxiety over time. They were plagued by catastrophic thoughts that they were going to disintegrate, go crazy, or die. And 80% experienced panic attacks. Those agoraphobics who were led to believe they were exercising control remained unperturbed and free of catastrophic thinking, and relatively few of them experienced panic attacks. Isn't that crazy? They got the same thing, but it was how they believed. My point is this. The more we know and believe we can control, the better. Knowing ourselves gives us choices, and the perception of choice and control, even on its own, helps a lot. But imagine what happens when that awareness and control isn't simply based on what Bandura describes as illusory control, but on something that is more accurate, like actual self-awareness. So let's talk about what it means to elevate self-awareness. Let's talk about that and self-understanding. And I want to highlight 3 strategies that were critical to becoming more differentiated. And if you want more expanded version of this, I wrote a whole book about this, and Composed it's a short book and a short little read, but it does get into some depth of these strategies that we've described over the last few weeks, and it's very practical. And I will be using leader talk for the next couple of minutes, and I hope that you'll see the implications for every high pressure moment you are going to experience in the next 2 weeks. Even though I'm talking about leaders, most of you will translate this to whatever high pressure moment you're going to be experiencing. So in my first book, let's start with self-awareness. In my first book, Dying to Lead, subtitle was Sacrificial Leadership in a Self-Centered World. There's a chapter titled, Who Are You, Really? That's literally the chapter, Who Are You, Really? It's a chapter about self-awareness in which I define self-awareness as a combination of knowing ourselves and at the same time knowing how others see us. And when I ask leaders whether they're self-aware, what I'm really asking is if they know themselves and if they understand who they are and how others see them. So this is the double bind of becoming more self-aware. Self-awareness isn't as simple as knowing yourself, because it also involves an increasing understanding of how others see you. And for some of you, that's net new, like that's news. And it's for some of you, like, that makes sense. So just think about that. It's these 2 sides. Have you ever been in a situation where someone knows you, who knows you well, provides you with feedback on how they think you could be a better version of yourself? Like in most cases, these feedback sessions come in the form of conversations with others at work or with a close family member who have a complaint with how we have done something or how we've shown up in a certain situation. I hope I'm not the only one that's had those conversations. The fundamental starting point for these conversations is whether or not we are willing to hear someone else's perceptions of who we are, how we're performing, and then being willing to hold their perceptions in tension with our own. As I stated earlier, self-awareness always includes how we see ourselves and how others see us. Self-awareness, by the way, is also a process of becoming a better version of ourselves. This is why tools and conversations that give us insight into who we are immediately highlight the gap between who we are now and who we could become. It's interesting. This is all part of, I saw that I don't know if this is true, but I saw a Google study yesterday that one of the most searched things from this last year was this question: can I change? Kind of fascinating. This is one of the most fundamental starting points for use of our WILD toolkit. Like when we work with organizations, that people walk through these tools over a year. And I will say this, that one of the things that happens typically for leaders and groups of people who work together in their first year of using these tools is that they become more self-aware. It's just a big insight. They didn't realize the awareness that they could generate. In the second year, they take that awareness and they begin to practice. They start to try some things out. And then what's interesting is that when we get into third year and beyond, we start to see shifts in people's identity as that awareness deepens and it changes. And our primary challenge is not bridging the gap, but is ours being all of ours, but in seeing ourselves in a constant process of discovery and movement forward. Does that make sense? Toward greater self and other awareness. And so my question is this: are you increasing in self-awareness? And what would be the impact if you did? The second strategy is recognizing contribution. I once heard a man named Dr. Edwin Friedman, who was an expert in leader development and family systems theory, a pulpit rabbi. He's a therapist and leadership development consultant. I heard him speak to a group of business leaders. And one leader asked Dr. Friedman the litmus test for identifying an individual with the greatest capacity to lead. And Dr. Friedman paused and responded, a person in any system of people who has the most capacity to lead is the person who can express themselves with the least amount of blame. He went on to describe that whether we are talking about our families or work relationships, these individuals are the people who constantly define themselves, sit clearly in who they are, and are willing to take responsibility in situations in which they have let people down. And I would take Dr. Friedman's words one step further. The person who has the most capacity to lead well in high stakes situations is the person who not only expresses themselves with the least amount of blame, but is also willing to take full responsibility for what they may have done wrong. And let me go on to say this: recognizing our contribution and need. I'm going to talk about grace for a second, and need for grace, even in the most difficult situation, is built on our understanding that there is more to see. It's like staring at the door you're not certain you want to open. You know there's something behind that door to see, but you're afraid because behind that door lies truth. We want we want to live our lives in rooms full of doors that we open or shut at will, and at times when it's comfortable to open them. We want to control seeing the reality of our contribution in our world. But the most difficult doors to open are those that shed light on our shame, our doubts, our fears, and our mistakes. And here's the powerful part. It's not only truth that lives behind those doors, but grace is there too. And grace is powerful because it not only brings the possibility of forgiveness where it may not be deserved, but it also is challenging because opening the door also brings us face to face with the reality that we need it. The reality that we have something that we might need to take responsibility for. When we take a look at our contribution to various relationships and situations in our lives, we're confronted by the truth of whether or not we've done the right thing, said the right thing, made a mistake, hurt someone else, or even hurt ourselves. And the moment we consider opening one of those doors, asking for forgiveness or getting real in relationships, is also the moment when we're confronted by our own need for grace and the question of whether or not we deserve it. And our recognition of our need for grace both calls us to accountability and opens the door to forgiving ourselves and others. So that next question I have is, are you increasing in your capacity to recognize your contribution, both good and bad? The final strategy is related to elevating it's related to self-awareness, is self-regulation. Psychologists call the ability to make choices regarding how I'm going to respond emotionally, they call it self-regulation. Therapists may call this mindfulness or presence. People on the street call it maturity. Leaders often refer to it as composure. Self-regulation is the ability to monitor what we're thinking and feeling and to maintain our ability to make choices. It really comes down to choice. Doing so allows us to manage our emotions and maintain our ability to see what's happening with others. And it would be a lot easier if our problems were ones of execution, like just getting something done. However, the reality is that our ability to execute is directly impacted by how we show up under pressure and our ability to see situations and people clearly. And self-regulation is a common issue for leaders and every one of us because, by definition, especially when we get into leadership roles, now we're responsible for not only managing ourselves, but for managing the experience of others. And at its core, self-regulation is about maintaining our ability to make a choice and not act out of compulsion. And those lowest on self-regulation struggle to act with intention and are more often at the mercy of whatever they're feeling. And pressure oftentimes causes it to get worse. That's why this series has been about that, because we begin to respond to others based on our surging moments or our surging emotions and not based on what's best in the situation. And this doesn't mean you're a bad leader if you have a tough time avoiding the pressure to react that way, but that there is, for all of us, is to see that there's something to work on. So let me finish with this. We open the conversation. Our ability to manage our emotions, to remain composed, and to be the best versions of ourselves under pressure also does not occur in a vacuum. Self-awareness, self-regulation, recognizing contribution, none of them do. In the soup of life, it is the mixture of our strengths and weaknesses that makes us all better versions of ourselves. Although that shouldn't be a revolutionary thought, many in our culture are driven by an all about me belief. And the reality that we don't achieve results on our own. That's the reality. We don't feel on our own. We don't define ourselves on our own. We don't function best on our own. We perceive, feel, relate, and act in community and trying to become more self-aware.